The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley, Chapter 22, Flight. There must be something in the airship that he could sway himself with for the trip across the boiling seas. With this in view, he made a frantic search of the entire cockpit. Doggo's rifle and ammunition were still there, but his own he had left in the room on his hurried departure. Here, too, was the little stone lamp by the light of which they had watched their instruments beneath the kayak covering. Even some of the provisions were left. Finally he came upon some boxes which he did not recognize. A rank smell became evident upon a closer examination. Gingerly he opened one of the boxes. It contained flesh, finely ground and putrid, and in this carrion were wriggled and swarmed scores of small white grubs. The last of Cabot's doubts vanished. These were devil souls which he and Doggo and Quiven had been expected to carry to Cupia to found their new empire of Wu-Mangs. Evidently his hosts had expected some possible trouble for him, and therefore had prepared the plane for a quick getaway by Doggo and Quiven. Indignantly, the lone Earthman emptied out box after box onto the ground and mashed the contents into dirt with his sandaled feet. By this time it was nearly pitch dark, but of course this would make no difference while flying through steam clouds, for visibility under such circumstances would be impossible even in daylight. If he only had some sort of covering for the cockpit to keep out the steam, he could fly just as well at night as by day, except for one danger. How could he be warned of flying too high, passing through the circumambient cloud envelope, and being shriveled to a crisp by the close proximity of the sun? In despair, the Earthman sat beside his beached airship as the velvet blackness crept out of the east and enveloped the planet. So near and yet so far. He had successfully transmitted himself through millions of miles of space. From Earth to Poros, he had escaped the clutches of Formians and the Roys. He had built a complete radio set out of nothing, and he had talked with Cupia across a boiling sea. He had traversed those seas once without accident, had eluded the machinations of the Womangs and their moth-grubbed souls, and yet here he was, only a few miles of ocean separating him from his loved ones, and nevertheless blocked effectually by a lack of a few yards of cloth. Oh, what a fate! As the last purple flush died on the western horizon, Miles suddenly jumped to his feet and laughed aloud. The solution was so obvious, it had completely escaped him until now. It was the setting sun that suggested the escape from his dilemma. There's no sun to boil him at night. Of course not. Therefore, why not soar straight up, pierce the envelope, and fly above it to Cupia, letting the clouds protect him from the heat of the boiling seas, as they normally protect the planet from the light, and the heat of the sun? At any rate, it was worth trying. To remain where he was would mean either eventual starvation or the recapture by those terrible Wu-Mangs. So by the light of his little King stone lamp, he made a hasty lunch of his few remaining provisions, and then took his stand at the levers for the new experiment in Peruvian navigation. Up he shot through the dense blackness, up to a height which in earth would have filled his blood with air bubbles, and would have suffocated his lungs. But on Poros, with a thicker atmospheric shell and its lesser gravity, the change was not so evident. Far to the eastward he saw lights of Yat, the city of beasts, but this was his only landmark. There was nothing on his gyro compass to tell him exactly which was north and south and east and west, nothing but his clinometer to indicate whether he was going up or down, nothing but his altimeter to indicate his approximate height above the surface of the planet, and these instruments he must read by the flickering light of a primitive open-wick stone lamp on the floor of a cockpit. What if this faint illuminator should become extinguished? He certainly could not leave the controls for long enough to use flint and steel to rekindle it. During the early part of his stay at Verkini, he had always gone to some one of the constantly burning lamps which was the primitive fire source of the furry Verkings. Later he had found several pieces of flint which were in investigating a small chalk deposit as possible alternative for limestone in his smelting operations. After the manufacture of steel had begun, he had practiced striking a light in his own more modern method, and therefore had always carried flint and steel and tinder with him in one of the pouch pockets of his leather tunic. It was with these crude implements that he kindled his oil lamp for the present flight. But this fire source would avail him little if a gust of wind should extinguish the primitive lamp. So, such an event, what could he do? This question was immediately put to the test, for his ship struck a small air pocket and dipped. Out went the light. Now he could no longer read his compass nor altimeter, but Happy thought he could determine the inclination of the plane from time to time by touching his clinometer. So on upward he kept. Excuse me. Presently he found it difficult to breathe, and this difficulty soon increased by a fog which choked his nostrils and windpipe, causing him to cough and sneeze. The water condensed on the airship and dropped off the rigging into the matted hair and the beard of the Earthman, yet still he kept up. Finally he breathed clear air once more. He pushed back the dripping locks from his forehead and wiped out the water-filled eyes with the backs of one wrist. All was still jet blackness, yet in front of him and above him there glowed some tiny points of light. Rubbing his eyes, he looked again. Stars? The first stars he had ever seen on Poros. A sky full of stars above. With some surprise, Malkabot noted that above him were swung the same constellations which he had seen familiar on Earth, among them the two Dippers, Orion and Cassiopeia. He strove to recall the inclination of the axis of Venus to the ecliptic, but all he could remember was that it did not differ appreciably from that of the Earth. This information was enough for his present purposes, however, for it meant that the star which he would call the pole star on Earth was approximately a north on Poros, and that its altitude above the northern horizon would give approximately the latitude of the location of the observer. The pole star, which he readily identified by means of two pointers of the Great Dipper, now hung about 20 degrees above the horizon, thus showing Cabot was opposite the southern tip of the part of the continent of Cupia which formerly was Formia. So he leveled out the plane, and then, turning his nose northwest by the stars, scudding along above the cloud envelope of the planet. It was not long before he noticed a quite appreciable increase of temperature. Gusts and swirls of hot vapor assailed him from below, so that it was as if he had not been for the gyroscopic steadying apparatus, he might surely have floundered. Even as it was, it took all his efforts to control his ship. He suffered fearfully from the heat, but it was not absolutely unbearable. Navigation so compelled his entire attention that he lost all track of time. He struggled on as in a dream, and had not the slightest idea whether he had been flying for hours only or for minutes. On and on he drove through the terrific heat, until at last he got so used to it that it actually seemed cooler. By Jove, he could almost believe the air really was cooler. So cautiously he tipped the nose of the plane downward and entered the clouds below him, feeling his way at a low rate of speed, and ever ready to slam on full force of his taffel engines and shoot upward once more. He gradually penetrated the cloud envelope which surrounds the planet, yet the heat did not increase. At last he was through, and below him twinkled lights, the lights of a small city or town. Throwing the plane level once more, he hovered down in true Peruvian fashion. The light of the town showed closer. Cabot's heart beat fast. There was a lump in his throat, and his hands trembled at the controls. Was this Cupia, his own beautiful kingdom of Cupia at last? Was he home? Or, and his heart sank within him, was this still some new continent with other nightmare beasts and horrible adventures? Whichever it was, he ought not to land too near to the town. His taffel motor was making a loud racket, but he was not afraid of being heard, for Cupian have no ears, and their antennae can receive only radio waves. So he skimmed low over the houses, straining to try to make out their style and architecture. But it was no use. The jet blackness of the Peruvian night obscured all below. Accordingly, he planned to land about half a stad from the village, and then reconnoiter at daybreak. This was to be accomplished as follows. His distance from the ground he would gauge from the lights of the houses, therefore he could hold his craft as nearly as possible level, and hover softly down, taking a chance on landing on bushes or trees. The plan worked to perfection. After just about the expected drop, he felt the skids grate on the solid ground, land once more after a sensational flight above the clouds. Oh, exhausted and relaxed, he shut off the motor and proceeded to crawl over the edge of the cockpit. Of course, he could not even see his own machine in the intense darkness. As he started to clamber out of the plane, suddenly tilted a bit under his weight, then gave a lurch and slid out from under him, dislodging him as it did so. He struck the ground, but it crumbled beneath him, and he felt himself slipping and sliding down a steep gravel bank until finally some sort of projection stopped his descent. To this projection he frantically clung. During his slide he had heard the loud splash of the airplane below, so he knew that there was water there. As he hung to the projection on the side of the steep sand bank, he looked around him in the jet black night, and as he looked he noticed the edge of the bank above him just showing up against the sky. The edge became more and more distinct. The sky above turned to slate, and then purple, and then red, and then pink, then silver. Day was coming once more. Cabot found himself clinging to a sharp spur of rock which struck out from the bank, so he hauled himself into a more comfortable position upon it and stared around the surroundings. His location was halfway down the precipitous slide of a crater-like hole in a quarter of stad diameter and 3 parstads deep, with the banks of which were of coarse black sand. At the bottom, a clear pool of water reflected the silver sky. There was no sign of either his rifle, his cartridge belt, or the plane. He possessed nothing save the leather tunic, his wooden Verking sword, a steel sheath knife which he had made in his foundries of Verkini, and the contents of his pockets. Even his leather helmet was gone. He espied it floating like a little boat far out onto the pond, but even as he looked, some denizen of the deep snapped at it, and it disappeared beneath the surface. This was a forewarning of what might happen to Miles if he should have the misfortune of slipping into the pool below. Well, he must risk it in an attempt to get out, or even a sudden death beneath the waters was preferable to starvation on a rocky perch. So carefully and laboriously he attempted the ascent. Many times he slipped back, losing nearly all he had gained, but fortunately the bank was rather firm in spots, and was dotted with large jagged rocks, which made an afford of a good handhold, so that eventually Miles reached the top. Here he found a flat plateau, flanked by a continuous hedge of bushes about 30 paces from the edge. These bushes were too high to see over, and grew so thickly together that Miles was unable to penetrate them. Round and round the top of the pit he walked, repeatedly trying to force his way out, but with no success. The day wore on. Miles became tired and hungry and thirsty and disgusted. By placing the small pebble in his mouth, he relieved the thirst for a while, but this had no effect on other symptoms. Finally, even the thirst returned. The thirst was aggravated by the presence, almost at his feet, of the clear pool of water within the pit. He almost decided to slide down and try it until he remembered what happened to the leather hat. So instead he began systematically to hack at the bushes with his knife and to tear them up by the roots at one given spot. At the end of an hour he had progressed only about a yard, so he gave this up too. He sat down, wrapped his arms around his knees, gazed at the silver sky, and thought of nothing for a while. Then he thought of Lilla and baby Q. Here he was, presumably in Cupia, perhaps within a few stads of them, and yet what good did it do him? It seemed to him as though the nearer he got to his loved ones, the more effectually he was separated from them. On the Farley farm in Edgartown, Massachusetts, where he had received the SOS message from the skies, it had appeared but a simple matter to step within the coordinate axis of his matter-transmitting apparatus and throw the lever in order to materialize on Poros. In Verkini there had been a more difficult task of securing an ant plane before essaying to cross the boiling seas. In the land of the Wumings he had been confronted with the almost insurmountable lack of swathing materials for such a flight, and now in Cupia at last he was hemmed by an impenetrable wall of trees. Yet, as he reflected, he had surmounted in turn each of these successfully more difficult difficulties, so why not this? With renewed determination he arose and resumed his grubbing operations. Another hour passed, and another yard of path had been completed. This was encouraging, and yet he had no means of knowing how much further there still remained for him to go. As he paused for breath he heard a crashing noise almost directly across the pit. Concealing himself as well as he could in the recess in which he had formed in the bushes, he watched expectantly. Presently the thick growth on the other side parted neatly, and a sharp edge of wedge appeared. This wedge appeared to divide the bushes until finally it came completely through. All curiosity to see what was pushing the wedge, Miles craned forward, but there was nothing behind it. It had been pushing itself? All the bushes slowly closed together again, and the wedge stood on 6 sturdy legs and trotted up the top of the pit until it came to the stop directly opposite the hiding place the Earthman. This gave him a good opportunity to observe it. Apparently it was some sort of massive insect. Its head came to a sharp cutting edge at the front of its 5 feet high, and its lateral projections extended diagonally forward from the edge, like the wings on a snowplow, to point well beyond the rear end of the animal. The two sides were covered with stiff backward-pointing bristles, which evidently served to catch on the bushes as the creature passed and thus hold whatever gains it made. Its eyes, like those of a crab, were located in long jointed arms, and it would raise whenever it wanted to look around. The lower edge of the sides of the wedge were serrated, and Miles soon learned what that was for. After wiggling its eyes about for a while, the creature walked to the edge of the bank, thus giving the watcher a good view of the body and legs within the projecting wedge, and slid off into the pit, where the splashing sound indicated that it was probably drinking. Soon it reappeared over the top of the pit. Evidently, the saw-teeth on the sides were to hold its progress up the face of the sandbank in much the same way the spines held the progress through the bushes. The wedge insect, upon topping the bank, made a bee-line for the edge of the clearing, thrust its nose between two saplings, furled its eyes, braced its feet against the ground, and started forcing its way through. Quick as a flash, Miles Cabot darted from his hiding place and followed. The creature, rolling its eyes to the rear, saw him and tried to back out. For what purpose he could not tell, but probably neither to attack him, or at least to prevent him from attacking its vulnerable body. But it was already in too far, and its spines held it securely. It did try to kick at him, whereat he followed not quite so close. Then it stubbornly stopped moving, pulled in its eyes and legs, and lay down within its projecting headpiece, where it gave it a prick in the tail with his Ver-King sword. The effect was immediate and sudden. The creature leaped to its feet and tore its way through the trees like a cyclone, plunging high in the air like a frantic horse. This left such an erratic and only partially spread path that the Earthman had the difficulty in following, but soon fell in far behind. But just as he was about to despair, the branches which he had parted ahead of him revealed a meadow of silver-green sward. He reached the end of the wood. Beyond the field was a grove of gray-branched lichen trees, through which he could see the steep red-tiled roofs of the village. Just short of the grove there grazed a herd of pale green aphids, the size of sheep, which the Cupians call unks, and which Miles was wont to call green cows. Close by his right hand was a large shrub with heart-shaped leaves, unmistakably a tartan bush. Steep red roofs, gray lichen trees, anks and tartans. This must be Cupia. He was home! Miles quoted aloud. Breathes there a man with soul so dead, who never so himself has said, This is my own, my native land. Cupia might not be his native land, but it was his own, the land of his wife and child, the land which his son was rightful king of, the land whose armies he had twice led to victory, and now he returned to lead them once again. Drawing a deep breath of Cupian air into his lungs, Miles raced across the meadow to the shelter of the grove of trees. From that point of vantage he inspected the village. The architecture was undoubtedly Cupian. In fact, its character was so clear he was even able to judge by it just what part of Cupia he was in, for the architecture was typical of the southeastern foothills of the Okarze Mountains, 1,000 stads or so north of Kuana, the capital city. These foothills held, among other spots of interest, Lake Luno on the island of which he and Lilla had built their country home, and the inhabitants of the mountains had always been intensely loyal to the Earthman, his golden-haired wife, and royal son. On the outskirts of the village, Cabot could see figures moving, figures in white togas with colored edges, figures with tiny vestal wings projecting from their backs, figures with butterfly-like antennae rising from forehead. These were Cupians, his own adopted countrymen. Yet they would never recognize him in his present condition, with shaggy hair, massive beard, and the leather tunic, and without any artificial wings and antennae which he had been accustomed to wearing amongst them. Therefore he could not yet reveal himself. He must first restore his appearance to normal, and also find and put on one of the small portable radio sets which he had contrived years ago in his laboratories of Mooney, in order to talk with these folk who had neither ears nor voice. So turning his back on the alluring village, he made a meal of the green milk of the grazing ox, and then he went out to circle the settlement and find a road. When he did reach the road, he recognized it, and now knew exactly what village this was. For the moment he could not recall the name, but he knew it to be a little town which he and Lilla had often visited, scarcely 20 stads from the Luno Castle. As he strode on toward Luno Castle, his thoughts raced ahead of him, sometimes picturing a happy homecoming with Lilla and baby Q standing in the great arched doorway to greet him, and sometimes desolation and destruction with the Prince Yuri, the murderer of the baby king, the kidnapper of Princess Lilla. What would Miles Cabot find on his beautiful island in Lake Luno?